When parties negotiate a contract, the assumption is that they are all, okay, both of the parties, they're all in a position to perform whatever it is that they've agreed on in that contract, because otherwise, what's the point? But non-performance can still occur in a contract. This can either be in the form of a minor breach, which, by the way, doesn't enter contract, right? But we'll set up situations where you need to pay some damages or indemnities, depending on whatever it is that you're dealing with, or a major breach. Now, a major breach may end a contract, okay? Terminate a contract. But this isn't something that you just rush into, because the problem is sometimes it might actually be more expensive to you if you do that, okay? It might be expensive to you if you just terminate a contract without figuring out alternative ways, okay? You would have dealt with that problem. So in this section, we are going to look at the legal implications of contractual non-performance in procurement and supply. And in terms of your study goals, by the time you're done with these, you'll be in a position to contrast remedies that apply to non-performance of contracts in procurement and supply, analyze the legal consequences of terminating a relationship in procurement and supply. So let's talk about all of that. Let's start with contrasting remedies that apply to the non-performance of contracts in procurement and supply. So if a contract term is breached, what follows usually depends on the nature of term, okay? The term that has been breached. Basically, is it a condition, a warranty, or an innominate term? And you should be in a position, by now you should be in a position to know the difference between, rather to know each of those ones, okay? And how they operate. You should be in a position to know what a condition is. Remember, that's a strong term. A warranty, which is a weak term. An innominate term, which is a term in between a condition and a warranty. And the effect will pretty much depend on what happens if a party breaches that condition. And you should also be in a position to remember that not all breaches will lead to termination of a contract, which is just a fancy way of saying that just because there is non-performance in a contract doesn't mean that that contract is going to end. How then do you remedy non-performance by a supplier that do not involve terminating the contract? And that is pretty much what we're looking at here, okay, in this part. Start with contractual provisions on performance. The thing is, at some point in business, okay, in fact, sometimes most of the time in business, you're going to be working with suppliers that you don't even, they are not necessarily your choice, given alternatives. And the only reason why you're working with them could be because of the expertise, or could be because of resources, which could be limited, or could be, the point is, you could just end up working with suppliers that, well, you don't like. In such situations, it is important that you have mechanisms in place to secure the performance of the agreed contract. So how do you go about doing that? Because again, relying on liquidated damages, okay? Because, we have a provision, a contract for, sometimes relying on that alone is not enough. So here are some of the things that you can think about, okay? Or that you can put in place when you are working with such. And the first one is express terms. So express terms are terms in a contract that you've specifically agreed to. Look, here's a quick thing you need to know. When you get into a contract, okay, you just don't get into a contract. What usually happens is that you meet the other party and you talk about stuff, okay? You try to convince them to agree to contract with you, or they try to convince you to agree to contract with them. The things you're saying at this point, the negotiation phase of that contract, are pretty much what is known as representation, okay? Which is the reason why if they are lies, they become misrepresentation. But the thing you're saying at this point is just representing what you'd like, okay? Basically, you're just convincing the other party that it will be a good idea for them to get into a contract with you. Now, not everything you're saying there at that stage is going to be part of the contract. That is important for you to understand. Think of it this way. Dating, marriage. The stuff you say in dating, not everything you're doing during that stage is actually going to happen in marriage. In fact, most of them won't. Most of the stuff you say won't even be part of the marriage. Okay? So that's the same thing. The things you're saying during the representation stage may not necessarily end up becoming part of the contract. But if in fact some of the things you say are expected in the contract or become part of the contract, then they become terms of that contract. And so if you specifically agree to certain things, either in writing, well, mostly in writing because that is the easiest way to prove that. But the point is, if you specifically agree to those things and expect them to be in that contract, then they become express terms in that contract. For example, I want a t-shirt, okay? Good. What t-shirts do you make? We make the best quality t-shirts. Yeah, see, that's just representation. Here's an express term. I want a black t-shirt of a certain size, and it's probably going to have something written on it. Now, what would you like for that t-shirt to have written on it? Is the right network? See, that's the thing. So that becomes an express term because you've specifically agreed on what I want, and that is what I'm pretty much willing to pay for. Such terms or documents should identify the ways in which the supplier's performance is to be measured. Typical measures include times or date, key performance measures, weights, and reference to international quality standard. So with something like that, you can easily define your acceptance or rejection criteria when dealing with the supplier, like whatever you've supplied doesn't meet the standards, and therefore you're not taking them. See, now at that point, you're really managing the risks associated with getting into a contract with a supplier you don't even like. And even if you like the supplier, it doesn't really mean that their performance is going to be good because you like them. So either way, you need to know how you're going to measure, or you need to know basically the express terms that you're going to use at that point. Here's an example of a term. Delivery of goods must be made within X number of days from the date of the order confirmation as stated in attachment B. So in that term means that you're going to have a different, session, the so-called attachment B, which will contain things like order confirmation, date delivery, delivery method, etc. So the point is that express terms should outline more than just the payment terms. Okay, they should outline the obligations of the parties, be it the buyer or the seller. This should include things like making resources or specialist equipment available, hosting meetings, responding to communication in a timely manner, etc. Now, okay, here's something you can think of. So it's learning by doing. Is a question for you. Actually, is an application for you. Other than payment, what obligations are likely to be required from a buyer in the following contracts? So number 1, contract for the supply of goods. Number 2, contract for the supply of services. And contract for the supply of research. So think about that, okay? Implied terms are the next one. Implied terms are not expressly written into a contract, but they are reasonably assumed to be necessary in order to fulfill the requirement of the contract. Think of it this way. So we know what express terms are, right? These are the terms that you've specifically agreed to on that contract or in that contract, right? But then there are things which you may not specifically agree to, but that are still going to be expected to be part of that contract. For example, if you buy something, okay, you order something, then who's supposed to deliver that? Unless otherwise stated, usually the assumption is the supplier is going to deliver it. See, that's something that is just implied, okay, unless we say otherwise. There is also the assumption that whatever the supplier is selling is going to be of a good quality or fit for the purpose intended by the buyer. If I describe what I want to you, if I describe what I want, right, to you, and you're the seller. So in this case, the sale is based on description. Then whatever you're selling to me should match the description. See, that's implied. I don't have to say, it doesn't have to be chatted out in terms of express terms. And the same thing goes for example, if you show me a sample of something, then the assumption is if I buy that thing, then the bulk that you're going to supply should correspond to the, to the sample. So those are some of the things that could be implied in a sale of goods contract. The point is, these are terms that while you may not specifically agree to, the law will assume that we specifically agreed to those things, or will assume that those things are there in the contract. In order for a party to rely on the use of implied terms to facilitate performance of a contract, it is important that the following things are true. Number 1, the implied term is a reasonable request and is equitable. That is, no party should lose out as a result. Number 2, the implied term is necessary to achieve efficiency in the performance of the contract. Number 3, the implied term does not contradict an express term in the contract. That is important. Any express term, especially if it's written, will always outweigh an implied term. So that is something you just need to think about. It shouldn't contradict the express term. Now, the other thing that we need to worry about here is change control. Let's say Company A agrees to purchase 1,000 units of a certain item from Company B, and the cost per item is $10. Now the contract is signed on January 1st, but due to some regulations by government, the price of raw material increases by 15%. At that point, like if something like that is to happen, how exactly can a supplier protect themselves? Because basically if you don't have any protection mechanism in the contract, then I'm just going to say, look, this is what you agreed on. I don't care about the price changes or whatever. This is what you agreed on, and this is what I'm paying. That's pretty much what the buyer is going to say. So what can a supplier do to protect themselves from such kind of changes in a contract? So change control terms provide a means of changing the requirement of a contract in a manageable way. They allow any of the parties to a contract to request or propose a change to be considered by the other party after assessing how it might affect the performance of the contract. Price variation clause is an example of such, which is pretty much what is happening in that example you gave of company A and company B. So that means the supplier can protect themselves using a price variation clause. Okay? Company B will notify company A that due to a 50% increase in the cost of raw materials, they propose an increase of price to say 11.5, okay? So $11.50 per unit. So company A will obviously have a certain duration, a length of time to look at that and then decide, okay? Are they okay with it? In which case the contract continue, or are they not okay with it? And that can be one of those reasons why the contract come to an end, because, can't do with this new price and it's a factor out of our control, and that terminates a contract. Anyway, so that change control thing, the price variation, is an example of that. There are a lot of other ways in which you can. And the point is, you're trying to figure out how can we protect ourselves against changes that might occur, especially if it is a long-term contract. So that's the thing with that. Now, as you are continuing, remember, if there is any question, you're supposed to ask. You're not supposed to be frustrated with your question and being like, they just asked a question and they didn't even answer. Yep, you do ask. Now, the other thing to worry about or to understand is a force majeure. A force majeure clause in a contract effectively allows the parties to suspend or terminate the performance of the obligation if they are affected by exceptional events outside of their control. And an example of such events would be things like acts of terrorism, war, fire, flood, industrial strike. And by the way, we're talking about industrial strike, not strike specific to a certain industry. I mean, if you work with a supermarket, or rather if they're supposed to supply something, a certain supplier is supposed to supply to a supermarket, and then the workers of that supplier strike, that is not industrial strike, that is just company specific strike. So in this case, we're talking about a situation where all the people in that particular industry are like, we are not, doing this. Like that time when, was it actors or writers in Hollywood? I think writers went on a strike, so something like that, okay? The thing you have to understand about force majeure is that you have to be specific about events that will fall under this category and how they are to be dealt with. Because generally such events may frustrate the contract, leading to termination. And that's another thing, okay? A frustration or the frustrating event is a way of terminating a contract. Frustrating event simply means that events outside of our control, okay, which make it impossible to continue that contract. And then those events end a contract. And those things you've mentioned, like war, flood, acts of nature, or act of God, can end a contract. The difference is that with the force majeure, we are saying that these events, okay, may end a contract, but you don't want them to end a contract. So if it occurs, then we probably need this amount of timeline to sort things out, and then you can continue the contract. Because otherwise they just end a contract, okay? Like it rains, there are floods, and maybe a certain bridge collapses, and that's the way that's the way your trucks are supposed to be passing, or the route your trucks are supposed to be passing when they're delivering items. So in that case, you might say, well, the bridge collapsed, we need another week so that we can reroute the trucks and they get to you. Otherwise, the contract is over because it's a frustrating event. We have no any other way of going, assuming there is no any other way. But if there is an alternative, we put it under force majeure. That means it will affect us in a contract, but it will allow for, alternative route. That's the point you have to understand there. Because frustrating events and force majeures can be confusing when you're dealing with contract law. The clause should also detail how long the event should last before giving the parties the right to terminate the contract. and how any costs, liabilities, and responsibilities should be settled. Now let's talk about something different from performance. Let's talk about clauses for default. Okay, picture this scenario. A person, or person A, lends person B a piece of equipment for a period of 3 years at a cost of $10,000 per year. Person B defaults on their payment 6 months into the terms of the agreement. Now, depending on the nature of that agreement, then person A may be entitled to immediately claim the remaining sum that is due over the next 30 months, okay, equal to $25,000 plus any interest that was agreed in that contract. Clause of default describes specific situation that would be considered as a default under a contract. And you see a lot of that, okay, in money lending contracts, like the loan agreements. So you take some money, you're supposed to pay, you default, what happens? Bank shows up, takes your car, whatever you did put up as collateral, and, whatever, okay? I mean, you buy a home through mortgage, you're like, yeah, I own my own home. And then you default. Good news, the bank comes, or they just sell that debt to someone else. That person shows up, takes takes possession of the house, ownership of the house actually, and then you say, it was a ripoff. So that's the thing here, okay? That's the thing you're talking about. One important consideration for default clauses is the rate at which any defaults on payment are charged. That is the interest or late payment charge which results from a missing payment. So it is important because if you set that rate, the default rate, okay, that interest to be so high, then a court may just look at it and say, you know what, that is not even compensation. That is just a fine. And the moment it becomes a fine, it switches from a civil law, which pretty much is what contracts fall under, private law, civil law, into a criminal law, because in criminal law, the intention is to punish the person. In civil law, the intention is usually just to compensate or to prevent something from happening, but still in a manner that doesn't necessarily cross over into the punishment/criminal side. The thing is that we're just going to say, well, is the interest commercially viable? If it is, then we're just going to approve that interest. And what is the reason? Why do they charge? Because, they took some equipment, I defaulted on the payment, you took it back. So now what? Why are you charging me interest? Okay, that's pretty much the idea here. Okay, so what are the reasons for the interest? Well, number one, any interest or charge reflects the administrative or the administration cost of following up and monitoring default payment that are due. Number two, any charges are also reflective of the lender's credit risk exposure, as they are lending items to a borrower who, due to their non-performance, has become a credit risk. But the thing you have to remember here is that just because you have that option, okay, to levy high payment or to pretty much activate the default clause, sometimes parties may not really choose to go with it. In short, what you're saying is that yes, there are other alternatives that you can use in your contract as opposed to just going with the default or the clause of default or the default clause. Okay, so the clause of default. And this will include get into a forbearance agreement. This simply means that you give the person more time. Okay, so it's like you're supposed to pay. Okay, yeah, so you're giving him more time to pay. That could be a choice. Number two, they may renegotiate the loan. Number three, the lender can refuse to make further loan to the breaching party until the existing loan agreement is completed, especially if these are all situations where you're servicing more than one loan, or you're giving this lender more than one loan. So you can say you're not financing the rest. Pay this one first. So those are some of the things. All right. So again, let's move on to the next thing. Now let's talk about penalties, liquidated damages, and unliquidated damages. And let's start with liquidated damages because these are very common in contracts. Okay, liquidated damages in this case, we're talking about an agreed pre-estimate of any charge that may be incurred as a result of a breach. You fix that amount. I mean, look, you get into a contract, you don't want the other party to default or to fail to perform something in that contract, right? So you have an agreement saying that if this happens, if you do this is how much you're going to pay. So that can be an amount that is fixed at the beginning of the contract. Or it can be something like for every week you delay to deliver, then it's going to be 1% of the invoiced amount per week. So if you fail to deliver this week, 1% of that amount, that becomes the liquidated damage. Next week, same thing, right? That's one way to look at it. The advantages of including a liquidated damage clause in a contract will include, number one, it provides a level of certainty to the parties of a contract in the event of a breach. Okay, so both parties know exactly what is going to happen if they fail to do something. Number two, it speeds up the process by which damage can be claimed, as the requirements to prove any loss is not as strict as in unliquidated damage or penalty, because remember, with unliquidated damages or penalties, which we shall look at pretty much in a few minutes or something, those ones usually you go to court for that, right? And the burden of proof is, a big deal in such situations. Next, liquidated damages clause may be seen as encouraging the contractor or the seller to perform consistently to the expectations of the contract. Now, the challenge with these clauses is that sometimes, what if the damage, okay, that has occurred, or the injury that has occurred in that contract is more than what was estimated? Like, think of it this way. Let's look at this example. Say the liquidated clause is 3,000 and the actual damage ends up being 3,500. Now, in this case, you're going to have the innocent party doing what? Incurring a loss of $500 because, well, 3,000. And yet, the injury is 3,500. So you pay 3,000. Well, that difference. So they incur that. What are the other disadvantages that you can think of? So let me know about that. Okay. What are the other disadvantages of liquidated damage that come to mind? Right. Let's move on to the next thing. In this case, it's penalties. These are similar to liquidated damages in the sense that it's money that you pay as a result of a breach. Okay. But the difference is the intention behind it. You see, with penalties, it's not just about the amount that you pre-agreed on. Penalties are not seen as a genuine pre-estimate of the cost of the impact of any breach and are often viewed as a punishment. Of course, the problem with this, as you've already pointed out, is that anytime there is something that is looked at as a punishment in a contract, then, there has to be a good justification for it in that contract. Otherwise, we'll just think of it as something that shouldn't even be there because, again, punishment in civil law, so there is that. But still, you can have them. And then something else that you can also have there is unliquidated damage. And, the thing with unliquidated damage is that it's simple. Liquidated is what you agreed on. Unliquidated usually is an amount that the court is going to award based on whatever happened, the breach of that contract. So when it comes to courts awarding unliquidated damages, some of the things that they'll factor in, exactly what is it that courts look for? So some of the things that they will factor in, and by they here I mean the court, will include what was the actual loss suffered by the innocent party. Number two, is it possible to return the innocent party to its position before the breach occurred? Because if that is the case, okay, then we are probably just going to say, let's go with that. Number three, what would be considered as a penalty and unfair to the defendant, and can these be avoided? So liquidated damages, you pre-agree to a certain amount. Penalties, the intention is actually to punish, which means to deter something from happening, which can be debatable. Unliquidated damage, an amount that is supposed to be awarded in a breach of contract, but that amount is not something that you agreed on at the beginning of that contract. It's an amount that the court will decide on. Okay? So that's the difference as far as those three are concerned. Now let's talk about, let's analyze the legal consequence of terminating a relationship in procurement and supply. When people get into a contract, when parties get into a contract, as you already know, they're not doing so because they want the contract to be terminated. Most of the time, you want the contract to be performed. But because of factors which could be beyond your control, or because of, whatever, the contract may end up being terminated before its time. Okay? So if that happens, then what comes next? And a number of things actually do come next, which is what you're supposed to talk about. Some of these things will include, let's start with the first one, which in this case is assessment of damages. At this point, you're aware that damages just refer to monetary compensation that is going to be awarded either because of a breach of a contract or, well, basically a breach of a contract, right? So is it an automatic thing? That's the first thing we need to ask ourselves, right? Is it just automatic? You're going to award you X amount of money because that is what you wrote there. So is that so? Anyway, picture this, okay? So look at this example. A business hired a contractor to install a heat exchanger at the business premise. So at some point after the installation, there was a leakage, and this business, what they did, they went out, found a second contractor who came in and was supposed to fix that leakage, or rather they fixed the leakage. But this second contractor failed to assess the entire situation, because had they done that, they would have noticed that there was a problem with the heat exchanger. So they didn't do that. They just did whatever they did and then they left. And what was the effect of this? Now, the business carried on as usual, and 2 months later, the heat exchanger exploded and damaged the business premise and the property, which meant that the business couldn't continue with its usual business activities. Now, the business then proceeded to make a claim against the first contractor for breach of warranty based on the loss of profits as a result of being unable to continue with business activities. What exactly do you think is going to happen in this case, or what do you think happened in that case? The loss was considered a speculative loss due to the explosion that occurred after the second contractor was hired. See, the argument was the business didn't contract the first contractor to come and, check the thing and all that. So there was probably some degree of negligence on their side. And the conclusion was speculative, reason. The damage was seen as too remote to attribute to the first contractor. Now, the general logic as far as damages are concerned is that there has to be a causal link, okay? Causal link in this case just means when something is the cause of something else. And if that is complicated, look at it this way. Let's say you run a business, okay? And in this case, you're selling computers and computer accessories. And so you hire these, or rather you order this supplier, or rather you order computers from these particular suppliers, and they're supposed to bring them on 8th of, May, April, whatever, 8th of May, right? And then they fail and they bring them on 8th of June. So an entire month in between there, right? And during this month, you probably, let's say in addition to computer accessories, you also started some graphic design business where you're printing stuff on t-shirts and selling them, which the suppliers are even aware of, right? And so you decide to claim for damage. You say, look, you guys delivered these computers late and I didn't have a computer to use for my graphic design, and therefore my t-shirt printing business also incurred a loss. So now I'm suing you for that. And you see, the link there doesn't exist, okay? So it's just going to be speculative. So that is pretty much what this is all about. So when it comes to damages, it's not automatic. We still need to prove that this thing, okay, caused that thing, and that is why I'm asking for this. So that has to be there. How then do damages get calculated? And let's start with the first one, which is expectation measures. Now, in this case, we are trying to put the innocent party in a position they would have been had the contract been performed as agreed. For example, if a party bought some goods and had hired a vehicle at a cost of, say, $50 a day for 2 days, and the supplier couldn't provide any vehicles as contracted, then the supplier would have to pay compensation at a level which would allow the buyer to hire a vehicle at short notice to meet its needs. Now, let's say the buyer goes ahead and, decide to hire a vehicle on that short notice, and they are charged $75 instead of, $50 because of the short notice. So that will be $75 times 2 days. So in this case, the supplier who defaulted, or in this case, the supplier who breached the contract, okay, is going to have to compensate this buyer. How much? $50. Why? Remember, the extra amount the buyer used. He was supposed to use $50, okay? And now they've used 75. So there's a 25 difference times 2, 50. So that's a loss that they've incurred that they wouldn't have incurred had the supplier done what they're supposed to do in the first contract. And that is what the supplier, in this case, is compensating. So that becomes an example of expectation measure. Now, there are two ways of calculating damages under expectation measures. And the first one is the difference in value between what the innocent party would have received in the contract and what had been received to date. And number two, how much it has cost the innocent party to fix the situation on their own. Now, it isn't always the case that those two methods are going to give us the same result. So one can give you a lot of money and the other one, whatever. So when it comes to choosing which method we are going to use, some of the things that will be looked at will include, would the breaching party be in a significantly worse position, and would the damage cause hardship? Number two, does the innocent party intend to implement any changes if the cost of fixing method is chosen? Now, the next thing that we also need to understand when it comes to calculating damages, or rather the next method, is reliance measure. You see, it's not always easy to figure out how much you'd have gained at the contract being, performed. And so that can make something like the expectation measures to be a bit difficult. So as an alternative, the innocent party may claim to be reimbursed for any expense that they had incurred in anticipation of the contract being performed. So the idea here is to put you in a position you are, okay? Ab initio, basically to put you in a position you are before the contract had started. And yeah, the thing is, it's better something than nothing, right? I mean, I get it, you're probably thinking, what about the time and all that? Okay, look at this example. So in Anglia Television v. Reed, the claimant, Anglia Television, engaged Oliver Reed to play the leading role in a television play. Subsequently, Reed pulled out and Anglia was unable to find a replacement. They abandoned the play but had incurred an expense amounting to $2,750. So in this case, it was held that while damages generally seek to put the parties in the position they would have been had the contract been performed, the parties may elect to claim reliance loss and recover expenses incurred in abortive transaction. And thus, Anglia was able to recover their expense from the defendant. So again, I get it. What about the time? What about, the idea with compensation is, it's not really like if you're going to get 100%. Maybe if you're lucky, you do. Sometimes you just take whatever is there and you move on. I mean, something being better than nothing. Now, let's talk about the third way we can calculate damages. Restitution measures is another way, and you can think of this one as quantum measure. The point here is that you are paying, or rather you are being compensated in proportion to the work done, or in as much as the benefit the party got, so the breaching party, the benefit they got from that contract. So let's say you're hired to clean a room for 10 days and you have to be paid $20 per day. So you work for, say, 5 days and the building burns down. So in this case, if you're supposed to do it for 10 at 20, so how much are you expecting out of that deal? So in this case, since you're expecting $200, you've worked for 5 days, so we give you 5 times 20. Okay, so you get your $100 and you move on. So that is quantum measure. So in proportion to the work done. The point here is that we want to restore the innocent party to the position they were in before the breach and to prevent unjust benefit to the breaching party. So the difference between, say, restitution and liquidated damages is the manner in which it's calculated. You see, with liquidated, that's the amount you agreed on, okay, before the contract started. With quantum merit or restitution, it's just in relation to what you've done, okay? So this is what I've done, and I'm not profiting. I'm just saying this is what I did, and this is what I want to be paid for. Think of it this way. Let's say you go to a restaurant, or let's say you go to a bar, okay, and you order beer, and then they give you some high-end whiskey. So you're like, okay, now you drink the whiskey, okay? So the question here is, what exactly are you paying for? Are you going to be paying for the beer that you actually ordered, or are you going to be paying for the whiskey that you've consumed? That's the thing. And if you are the alcohol, example is annoying to you, think of it in terms of food. You ordered for one food, which is less expensive. They give you another, which is, expensive. And that is what you consume. So you're paying for what you've consumed. That's the idea here. Now, the next thing, okay, the other way you can deal with non-performance is through specific performance. Meaning what? Meaning at this point, you don't want money. That's what you're saying. It's like, look, I don't want money. I just want them to do what they agreed that they're going to do in this contract. And that is what you want the court to approve. It's one of those mandatory injunctions, like you're going to do what you're supposed to do. But the thing you have to understand about this is that courts don't generally award these unless certain criteria are met. Meaning what? Meaning courts will only award this if adequate remedies are not available, the contract needs to be valid and enforceable, whether the innocent party has performed the obligation under the contract, that is something that the court will look at, and finally, the contract is not for personal service. If you hire somebody to come and perform, okay, a musician to come and sing on your birthday, and then they're like, no, you're not going to do it. The court cannot order them to actually come and sing on your birthday because that's like slavery, okay? So then in that case, the court will be like, yeah, just pay the amount that, whatever. Money will make more sense. So if it is something personal, then you can't be forced to do that. Anyway, yep, those are some of the things that we look at as far as damages are concerned. If there is any question, as always, ask. Now let's move on. Termination clause, okay? Now, there are many reasons where a contract may end up being terminated. And you're talking about termination, not breached, okay? Termination, in this case, you've just agreed, right, let's end this. Because that's another thing you have to understand when you're managing contractual risk, that sometimes the only way out of that risk is just to end the entire thing. So some of the reasons why this could occur could include things like one party may go bankrupt and be unable to perform the obligation of the contract and also pay damage which may result. So the thing with bankruptcy is that you can't continue the contract. It's one of those things that make the contract voidable. Because if you're bankrupt, it means one, you either can't perform the contract, or if there is damage in that contract, you can't even compensate. So that will terminate it. Number two, a change in ownership of one of the parties may result in a conflict of interest in continuing with the contract. Okay? You contract with this company, and then it's acquired by another company that is probably, you have a ownership in or something, whatever. The point is, there's a conflict of interest. And that means you have to walk out of that contract. Okay? Number three, a specific event may occur which affects the performance of the contract, okay, such as new policies set by governmental regulations. And this is where you have something like supervening irregularities, meaning what? A contract that was once legal suddenly becomes illegal. Like if you're selling certain products, product X, and now there's a new law which says you can only sell this product if you have this particular permit. So that means all the contracts that you have that you are doing when the permit wasn't a big deal or wasn't required suddenly become illegal to continue with. And finally, it is no longer practical for one party to continue with the performance of the contract due to something like a change in market demand. Now, the purpose of having a termination clause in the contract is so that when that thing happens, then the parties are aware that at this point the contract is over. So there is no doubt as to whether the contract is on or off. Okay? You must always know the effect of terminating a contract, especially since some contracts will include a termination fee. So that's the reason why you just can't terminate contract. This is common in rental agreements where the party renting a piece of equipment for a defined period of time has to pay a fee to end the contract early to cover lost profits. But then there are moments where, it's not all contracts that will have, although that's a bad idea, that's a bad way of drafting contracts. But some contracts don't have specific terms showing termination, okay? I mean, think of something like marriage. So what is the exit? What is the termination, clause in marriage? It's till death do us part. Yeah, but then what if you end up not liking the person? So they have divorce. And then there are those grounds which divorce will not even be granted. And so it's like, okay. Anyway, the point is, what if the terms are not clear? So when you're looking at, this is the reason why you need to understand the terms of a contract. Okay? When you're dealing with any contract, it is important for you to clearly read the terms. So the point here is that when it comes to you trying to understand vague, termination clauses in a contract, then some of the things you just need to know is that if the nature of the parties' relationship is formal, the period of notice required is generally longer. Number 2, the duration of the relationship and the extent to which the parties have invested time, effort, and resources, that is also important, as well as the scope of the contract entered into. So sometimes a contract can just have a term, something like the business reserves the right to terminate at any time for any reason at the discretion of the business. And if you see that, then that is just a problem, because in this case you're operating under the realm of uncertainty. They can just terminate the thing, and if you're the buyer at this point, you're like, okay. Or if you're the supplier, like, all right. So, tomorrow you could just wake up and there's a message saying we are no longer going to be working with you. And so you see, those are things you need to pay attention to if you're contracting with the other party. So the point here is that you have, again, to read all the terms in a contract. And if there is anything that you're not clear, that you don't understand, rather, that isn't clear, then you immediately seek legal advice. Don't be like, well, I watched this YouTube video on, this channel and, nope. Seek legal advice, because these rules will tend to vary from one country to another, from one county to another, from one jurisdiction to another. The point is, you always need to know what that specific law in your country talks about when you're in doubt. Because generally contracts, the principles of contracts are not that complicated. But then it's the terms that people put in contracts that will complicate these things, because everybody's trying to defend their position in that contract. Now, if there is any question, do let me know, And see you in the next video.